Hello and welcome to this Stories of My Life. This one is, of course, a difficult one. This one is the story of when my former stepson, Jarrod, had cancer. And I may break this up into a number of stories. This first one, I want to do the story up until the point where he survives, or up until the point where I encourage him to survive. And there'll probably be a follow-on story for that. So the story of Jarrod's cancer goes something like this. I was sitting at my desk in Germany. I was working for a large software company in Cologne, sitting at my desk. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and my telephone rings, my mobile telephone rings, and it's Jennifer calling me from her mobile telephone. Now, because we have 4 children, one of the agreements that we had was if it was absolutely necessary for either of us to speak to the other at any particular time, we were to call on our mobile phone, and we had our numbers obviously in each other's phones, and if a call came in on the mobile phone for either of us, then we were to answer that call, no questions asked. We were to excuse ourselves from whatever was happening. If we saw a call from the other on our phones, we were to excuse ourselves from whatever is happening, because to make that call meant that there was a problem, okay, and we had to take the call. It was not a social call. So if it was just I want to talk to you about something social, she was to call from the home telephone, not from the mobile telephone. So a call came in on my phone from Jennifer's mobile telephone. And I saw the call and I went, okay, something's up. I have to take this. So I took the call, and Jennifer just said, Jarrod has cancer. And I said, excuse me? And she said, I've just got the news. Jarrod has cancer. And I went, okay, I understand. What's the situation? What's the background? Tell me about it. And so she told me a little bit about what's going on. And she said, I need you to come home. And I went, yeah, sure, I understand. And we need to make plans. So let me get back to you. So I hung up, and my project manager was sitting next to me. And I just said, I need to speak to you in private for 5 minutes, please. And he said, sure. So we went to a meeting room. And I said to him, I've just been told my son has cancer, and I have to go home to deal with that situation, speak with my wife about it, and I have to organise whatever it is that we're going to organise. And I'm sure you understand. And he said, of course, whatever you need to do, you need to do. When do you think you'll be back? And I said, I have no idea. Obviously I'll be back as soon as I can be back, but I don't know his condition. I don't know anything about it. I'll be back as soon as I can, but this obviously has to take priority, and I would ask you to indulge me in that. And he said, yeah, sure, it's your son, and he has cancer. You understand my position about family, so by all means, go do whatever you need to do, and let me know when you can come back. And we'll hold the fort till then. It's okay. And so I then checked on the internet to see if I could get a flight, and I could get a flight out of Düsseldorf that evening. And I was home. I left the office about 5 o'clock, about an hour and a half later, and I was home by midnight, and read the email from my brother that the diagnosis was not in, the prognosis was not in yet, but it was certainly clear that he had a very severe case of cancer that had been developing for at least 18 months, given the medical records, but he'd been misdiagnosed by the doctor in Wagga, because it was unusual for a young man to have this sort of cancer. They diagnosed it as just trouble with his spine. And so I got home in the midnight and comforted Jennifer. In the morning, we went into town and we got tickets, one-way tickets for Jennifer and the 2 children. This was early December. one-way tickets for Jennifer and the two children to go out to Australia, to be with Jarrod over Christmas, to do their best to cheer him and support him. And I would stay in Germany, or stay in Ireland and work in Germany and London. I was working in London and Germany at the time, splitting my time between those two places. And we would see what happens next. So the earliest tickets we could get were out Tuesday morning. So we got the tickets on Saturday. They were for Tuesday morning, and Jennifer and the two children would fly to Australia on the Tuesday morning, and I would fly back to Germany. About an hour later, I got a flight back to Germany, and we would see what happened. So anyhow, of course, it was very unknown. Jarrod was still being tested. The situation with my brother was as a doctor, Stephen, and he was the one who noticed that there was a problem. Jarrod used to go to dinner at my father's house each Wednesday night, and as it happened, Stephen was in town doing his locum at the local hospital and was there for dinner at the same night as Jarrod was there for dinner. And Jarrod said that he'd had this back problem for a year and the doctor hadn't diagnosed it properly, etc., etc. He didn't know quite what to do. It wasn't getting any better. And Stephen said, well, that doesn't sound right to me. And being a doctor, because Stephen was a doctor, he rang the doctor that Jarrod was going to and asked him if he would send over a copy of his medical records, explaining that he was the uncle. He's the step uncle, if you want to say. I'm the stepfather, explaining he's the uncle and he's a doctor. He'd just like to look over it just to see if there's anything missed or any problem, because something just didn't sound right. And so duly, the medical records were sent over to my brother, and he looked over it and he just said, no, this doesn't look right. I want him to come in for a scan to the local hospital in Wagga. And they came in for a scan and found he had cancer, not just a bad back. And so what my brother then did was organise for Jarrod to very luckily jump the queue and be put under the care of the top cancer specialist in the country for the type of cancer that he had, who just so happened to work at the same hospital that my brother worked at. So my brother worked at the Royal North Shore Hospital in Sydney, and because he happened to work at the Royal North Shore Hospital in Sydney, and because the top cancer specialist in the country also happened to work there, Jarrod was lucky enough to be able to jump a very substantial queue. And that's how life is. And, I certainly don't apologise for the fact that my stepson got to jump the queue, right? Because in the end it saved his life. Now, what happened next was, of course, Jennifer and the kids went out to Sydney. By this time, Jarrod was at the Royal North Shore Hospital in Sydney and being checked out and scanned and all the rest of it. And we still didn't have a prognosis on the Tuesday morning when Jennifer flew out. I flew back to Germany. Results came back by the Friday, and I spoke with Jennifer on the Friday, and the prognosis was that he had about a 50-50 chance of living, which was a pretty serious prognosis at the time. So that was the early prognosis. The early prognosis was the boy had a 50-50 chance of living. And so that was pretty severe. A couple of weeks passed, and he was put through more tests, and as more and more tests were taken, his prognosis was considered worse and worse. He had a very severe case of Hodgkin's disease all through his spine. So the doctor in question proposed a new and experimental treatment that would require 8 bouts of chemotherapy over a period of 6 months. And this experimental treatment had not been tried before in the country, but her advice to us was this treatment might give him a 50-50 chance or better of surviving. And I said to her, I said to Jennifer, she's making this up because if it's an experimental treatment, they have no idea what the improvement might be. But given that they're saying the standard treatment has got little chance of success, the experimental treatment looks like the way to go. Now, everybody knows that he did live, and but what most people don't know who know that he lived is that the next two people who did the same treatment died. So in the first three people that I know of who did that treatment, the second two died. So that was the level of seriousness that was required to have that level of chemotherapy. Chemotherapy as we know it really is now. At the time, of course, I knew nothing about cancer and chemotherapy and all the rest of it. I believe the standard line back in those days. So Jarrod then duly went through his first bout of chemotherapy. Now, of course, by this stage it was just before Christmas when he did his first bout of chemotherapy. They were going to give him one lot just before Christmas, and then his second lot in the new year to start this whole 6-month process, 8 bouts of this chemotherapy. And so anyhow, he did his first bout, and of course it was just chemotherapy just destroys the body, right? The whole idea is to kill enough of the body that the cancer dies. So it just started destroying him, and he was very, very sick from the chemotherapy, etc. And by now it was coming up Christmas, so obviously at Christmas time you have to take time off from work because there's nobody at work. And so I went back home to Ireland and was in our house back home in Ireland. But of course, rattling around in the house, some friends invited me over for Christmas lunch, but I was rattling around in the house all by myself and feeling pretty morose and upset, obviously, because I didn't know whether my son was going to live or die. So after a while, what I decided to do was I said, okay, well, I'm going to go back to Germany to work. I'll spend New Year's Eve in Ireland, and then I'll fly off to Paris for a couple of days, and I'll spend 2 days in Paris, and then I'll go back to work in Germany, because Paris is my favourite city in the world. It's a city I really love, and I decided that maybe if I go to Paris for a couple of days, I could cheer myself up enough to get back off to work, because the obvious problem for me is, how do I go to work? How do I go to work and earn the money that the family needs and is going to need over the next 6 months when I'm so distressed that I don't even know whether my son is going to live or die? That was the big question for me. So I thought, I'll go spend 2 days in Paris and I'll cheer myself up. Now, of course, Paris on the 1st of January was a wet and windy city. Very cold it was on that day. And I decided, I stayed at my usual hotel and I went to my usual places around Paris. And I decided that, I'll just walk around. And I had my music player playing, and I walked around. And it was good it was raining, because I had tears in my eyes much of the time. I was extremely, extremely distressed about the future prospects for Jarrod. So I walked around Paris for quite a bit. Now I went to my favourite restaurant, a restaurant called S010 on the Champs-Élysées, and one of the waiters there knew me because I'd been there a couple of times, and he welcomed me, etc., etc., and asked me, he said, you don't look okay, what's the situation? And I just told him that I'd got the news that my son had cancer, etc. Now the other thing to add by this stage, so the man remembered me, and they actually gave me my meal for free that night. When I asked for my bill, they said, no, you a very touching moment. They said, no, you've got enough to worry about. This meal is on us today. So they gave me a free meal at my favourite restaurant in Paris. But what had happened was the chemotherapy had been so bad that Jarrod had said to his mother he didn't want to go through the chemotherapy. He didn't want to go through the whole process. He'd prefer to die than to just go through the process. So of course, this was in his break. He'd done one round of chemotherapy. He was going to have his next round in about 3 weeks. And he was saying to Jennifer, I don't want to do this. I can't do this for the next 6 months. I want to give up. And Jennifer couldn't persuade him into fighting for his own life. So I called Jennifer a few times and said, I'd like to talk to Jarrod. I'd like to talk to him about his next round of chemo, etc. And I'd called him 3 or 4 times like that while I was still in Dublin. And each time he said, no, I don't want to talk to Peter. Because he knew that the reason I was calling him was I was going to encourage him to fight for his own life. And he didn't want to have that conversation. And I honoured the fact that he didn't want to have that conversation, so I just left him be. So as it was, I was walking around Paris, listening to my music and thinking about Jarrod and the hopes and dreams I'd had for him, which were not working out at all. And now the situation of him having cancer and the possibility that he might die from this cancer. So I was just wandering aimlessly around Paris, and I found myself standing under the Champs-Élysées. One of my favourite places in Paris to stand is under the Arc de Triomphe. Sorry, I was standing under the Arc de Triomphe, looking down the length of the Champs-Élysées. It's one of my favourite views in all of Paris. When I stand under the Arc de Triomphe and look down the Champs-Élysées, it's just a good feeling. There is no other scene in the world that's quite like that. So standing under the Champs-Élysées, standing under the Arc de Triomphe, looking down the Champs-Élysées, and thinking to myself, what can I do? I mean, I don't want the boy to die, but he won't talk to me. He won't listen to his mother. What can I do? And I looked, of course, in the Arc de Triomphe is the eternal flame at the tomb of the unknown soldier. And I looked at all the murals on the wall of the Arc de Triomphe. The murals represent battles and wars that French soldiers have fought. And I was looking at all the murals and I was thinking about the tomb of the unknown soldier and the eternal flame, and all these thoughts were crossing through my mind. And of course, anybody who knows me knows that I was a Christian man from the age of 16 to 44. And, I'd always been taught, ask God for what you want, and God had always delivered for me. So I was standing there thinking about all this, and I thought to myself, I don't know what to do. I have no idea what I should do. So maybe I should pray over this, and maybe God will show me a way, right? This is the belief system that I was involved in, that I had. So under the Champs-Élysées, I just shut my eyes and said, God, I never ask you for very much. I don't bother you so much and ask you for so much, but I don't want my son to die, and I don't know what to do. And I really, really, really would appreciate, some idea, some guidance. What can I do for my son? And as clear as a bell, and that's what I was praying, shutting my eyes and praying this, and saying this aloud. And clear as a bell, this voice just said, call your son. And I was like, okay, because I'd been hearing that kind of voice for a long time. So this voice said, call your son. So I was standing under the Arc de Triomphe looking out down the Champs-Élysées. It was raining lightly, it was windy, it was a bitterly cold night, in my very thick leather jacket that I have. And I said, okay. So I pulled out my phone and I called Jennifer's cell phone in Sydney. And I said, I want to speak to Jarrod, please. And I heard her say to Jarrod, Peter wants to speak to you. And I heard him say back, well, I don't want to speak to him. Please explain that I don't want to speak to him. And Jennifer started to explain, but I already heard. And I said, Jarrod misunderstands me. I'm not asking. And so she turned around and she said to him, you misunderstand him. Peter said you misunderstand him. He's not asking. And so Jarrod came to the phone. So decided he would accept the phone call. And he said, yes. And I said, I want to speak with you. And he said, okay, I'll listen to what you have to say. And I said to him, good. I'm standing right now under the Arc de Triomphe, and I'm looking down. I said to him, I understand from your mother that you don't want to do the chemotherapy. And he said, that's right. I said, you understand that if you don't do the chemotherapy, you will die. And he goes, I understand, but I can't do the chemotherapy anymore. And I said, well, that's okay. I'm not going to ask you to do the chemotherapy. I'm not going to talk to you about that. He said, really? I said, no. I got a question I want to ask you. And he goes, I said, I want to ask you a question. Do you mind if I ask you one question? And he said, okay, you can ask me a question. And I said to him, I'm standing under the Arc de Triomphe, next to the tomb of the unknown soldier, next to the eternal flame. And I'm looking down the Champs-Élysées. And it's a bitterly cold night. It's raining and the wind is blowing. And all the lights are turned on the Champs-Élysées. And it's possibly the most beautiful sight in the world. It's, for me, one of the most beautiful sights in the world. I'm standing here because I'm trying to cheer myself up from the situation that we are in. And the question I have for you is this: are you willing to give me your word that you will stand on this spot in 1 year's time? Will you stand next to me in 1 year's time in this spot? And will you give me your word for that? And he stopped and he thought about that. And I don't know if it was 10 seconds or 2 minutes. It was a while. He stopped and he thought about that. And he said, yes, you have my word. And I went, okay, great. Now put your mother back on the phone. So Jennifer, he gave the phone to Jennifer. And I said to Jennifer, the man has given me his word. He will be here, standing under the Champs-Élysées in 1 year's time. What I want you to do is go down to Gowings. Gowings being a big store in Sydney. You must go down to Gowings tomorrow. You must buy him the biggest, heaviest leather coat you can find because it's really cold here. And you must hang that coat up in his room. And every time he wants to quit, every time he wants to quit, you point to that coat and you tell him that he's given his word that he's going to be standing under the Champs-Élysées, standing under the Arc de Triomphe on the Champs-Élysées New Year's Eve, New Year's Day next year. You remind him that he's given me his word to do that. And you hang that coat up in his room. And she's like, okay, I will do what you tell me to do. And so they did. The next day, they took a cab over to Gowings and got a coat. I told Jennifer, do not look at the price tag. Describe what it is you want and what you want it for, and don't look at the price tag, because the price tag is going to be a sticker shock in Sydney. Said, just put it on the Amex card, and I'll see it when it comes on the Amex card. And I think it was 1,800 Australian dollars was the coat. And it wasn't really heavy enough for that kind of weather in Paris, but it was a very nice coat. $1,800, you'd expect to get a nice coat, right? So I think it was $1,800, that coat. And so the boy did. He gave me his word that he would be there. And sure enough, it wasn't exactly January. We didn't get to the Arc de Triomphe, stand under the Arc de Triomphe, until February. But he gave me his word, and he was there. Now, of course, the way that works is when a man says, I can't do this, I just can't do it. I don't want to do it, I can't do it, I'd rather die than do this. You can't win the argument by saying, well, you have to do it, otherwise you're going to die, right? You can't win the argument that way. You can't motivate a man to save his own life by saying, if you don't do this, you're going to die. That's not how you save a man's life in that situation. How you save a man's life in that situation is you describe to him a possibility, you describe to him a picture, something that he can put himself in, and then ask if he's willing to give his word that he will live up to that picture. And if he says no, then you've lost the argument. If he says yes, then you know he's going to fight like hell to live up to his word, to be in the picture. Now, Jarrod as a lad was not a lad who lived up to his word. Well, was not a lad who always lived up to his word. And he had me as an example of how a man can live up to his word. So he knew in that conversation, when I had that conversation with him, he knew and understood that what I was asking him to do was make a commitment, give me his word that he absolutely would fight like hell through the chemotherapy to make it to the Arc de Triomphe next year. And full credit to the lad, he did. Now, a couple of other things just to add to this story was, of course, we did stand under the Arc de Triomphe there 1 year later, and we did get a passerby to take a snap of us standing there. Excuse me. I went back to the S010 cafe. I went back to the S010 cafe, and the same waiter was there who was there a year before. And he remembered me. And he said, hello, how did it turn out? And I said, this is the boy. Excuse me. I said to him, this is the boy who had cancer last year. And you gave me a meal. I said, look, here's 50 euros. Please buy champagne for the staff. Sorry. I said to him, please buy champagne for the staff. And they all celebrated. They all came to the table and celebrated and had a good time because the boy survived. Such a lovely touch. And there were many other stories that occurred during this period. But the other touching thing there was, of course, Jarrod went through his chemotherapy. He was quite obviously ill and had a lot of problems afterwards with his health. So I said that he should come and live in Ireland for a year and spend some time living with us and going around Europe, enjoying himself, having survived this very close brush. And so finally he came over to Ireland, finally got to Ireland, and I finally got home. I'd had trouble with visas, etc. And I finally got home and walked in the door, and there he was. And I could give my boy a big hug for fighting his way through very, very, very difficult circumstances and keeping his word and coming out the other side. So we decided, I gave him a big hug and was very happy to see him alive. And I said to him, I want to take you down to the local for dinner. I want to talk with you privately outside the house. So he said, yeah, okay. And we went down to the local and had dinner and a couple of pints. And I said to him, I just want to tell you I appreciate you taking my phone call, and I appreciate you understanding what I was doing, and I'm very, very happy you fought on through this. Really very happy that you fought on through this. I'm very happy to have you here. And he looked at me and laughed, and he said, well, I am pretty happy to be here. I'm pretty happy to still be here. And he said, if you didn't make the call, I would be dead. I said, yeah, I know. And so we had that conversation. To have your son look you in the eye and say, if you didn't make the call, I would be dead. And so I was really happy to have him. I was really happy that he survived his bout with cancer. Now, of course, there are other stories attached to that, but that's for my way of thinking, that's a really touching story. That the boy was so sick that he didn't want to live anymore. He didn't want to go through the whole chemotherapy process, which was the only way we knew how to save his life at the time. That I could make that call, that I could pray as my religion said I should, that I got an answer from whoever I got an answer from, that I made the call, and that we all acknowledged that the call was the call that inspired him to fight for his life. And it wasn't, will you go through the chemotherapy, but will you stand here beside me in 1 year's time, was the question. That all makes a great lesson in life for anybody, any young man who wants to listen to that and say, yeah, if I'm ever faced with one of my loved ones being like that, or if I'm ever faced with it myself, this is one way that worked for somebody else. So that's it's a very good story of my life. Now, of course, later on I was talking with Jarrod, and I was asking him, I was saying to him, it's a shame you had your cancer, and some things are more difficult for you now because it did affect his body, etc. And he said, if I had the choice, if I could go back and I could have the choice, and someone said, I could give you a magic pill and this cancer would be cured, he said, I wouldn't take it. And I said, what? He said, I wouldn't take it. And I said, I don't understand. Can you explain it to me? And he said, I'm a different man now. He said, I'm a different man now. I'm a better man now. He said, having cancer for 6 months has made me a different man. And I wouldn't be the man I was if I didn't fight through that cancer for 6 months. So no, if someone had come along with a magic pill and said, I've got a magic way of curing your cancer, knowing what I know now, after the event, I'd say no, I'd go through it again. I went, really? Okay, that's very interesting. And I didn't really know what he meant by that until after. That's something you have to experience. So I didn't really know what he meant by that until after I disowned him and went through being suicidal myself and coming out the other side of being suicidal and disowning my former children. So I didn't really know about all that until then. So there you are, the story of my life about my stepson Jarrod having cancer and how that went, and how I was privileged and honoured to inspire him to fight for his own life. I hope you liked that story. Thanks very much for listening.